The sun was barely clearing the horizon over Henderson Field on February 13th, 1943, when Lieutenant Saburo Sakai rolled his Zero into a reconnaissance pass over Guadalcanal. What he spotted on that morning would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rows of new American fighters sat beneath camouflage nets, their dark blue paint almost black in the dawn light. The silhouette was unmistakable, wrong somehow, with wings that bent downward in the middle like a seabird folding for a dive. Sakai had 30 confirmed kills to his name. He knew every American type by sight: Wildcats, Warhawks, Airacobras, even the troublesome P-38 Lightnings. But these were different. Massive engine cowlings, enormous propellers, and those strange inverted gull wings that gave the aircraft an aggressive, predatory stance, even while sitting motionless on the ground. He radioed the sighting back to base at Rabaul. New fighter type observed at Henderson. Large single-engine design. Unusual in wing configuration. The intelligence officers acknowledged his report with casual interest. Another American variant, they assumed. Nothing that would fundamentally change the tactical situation. Within weeks, that assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. The aircraft Sakai had observed was the F-4U Corsair, and it was about to revolutionize air combat in the Pacific. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For the Imperial Japanese Navy in early 1943, air combat doctrine remained unchanged from the principles that had guided them since the 1930s. Success in fighter combat meant outturning your opponent, getting inside his radius, achieving the gun solution through superior maneuverability. Japanese pilots trained endlessly in horizontal combat, perfecting the tight circles and snap rolls that would put their guns on target, while denying the enemy a firing opportunity. This philosophy had been validated by early war successes. The Mitsubishi A6M0 embodied these principles perfectly. Weighing barely 9,500 pounds with a pilot and ammunition, it could complete a 360-degree turn in less than 12 seconds at optimal speed. American fighters needed 18 to 20 seconds for the same maneuver. In the turning fight that Japanese doctrine expected, this advantage was decisive. The Zero achieved its remarkable agility through ruthless weight reduction. No armor shielded the pilot from enemy fire. Fuel tanks lacked self-sealing protection. The airframe itself was built as light as engineering would allow, with minimal structural reinforcement. Every ounce saved went toward making the aircraft more nimble, more responsive, more capable in the horizontal dogfight where Japanese training excelled. From Pearl Harbor through the first 18 months of war, this approach seemed vindicated. Zero pilots dominated American opposition in the Philippines, in the Dutch East Indies, over the Coral Sea. The F-4F Wildcat, America's standard carrier fighter, was hopelessly outclassed in turning combat. Wildcat pilots learned quickly that attempting to dogfight a Zero was suicide. They developed workarounds, the Thach weave for mutual defense, hit-and-run diving attacks, but these were defensive measures born of necessity rather than superiority. Japanese confidence in their tactical model ran deep. Senior officers believed they had solved the fundamental equation of air combat. Maneuverability was the ultimate arbiter. Courage and skill would prevail over crude industrial mass production. The Americans might build more aircraft, but Japanese pilots flying superior designs would maintain qualitative dominance. Warning signs were appearing by late 1942, but they were easy to dismiss. The P-38 Lightning had demonstrated that altitude and speed could neutralize turning advantage. Some American pilots were refusing to dogfight, instead using vertical tactics that Japanese training barely addressed. But these seemed like adaptations by an inferior opponent, tactical band-aids rather than a fundamental shift in combat philosophy. What Japanese planners failed to recognize was that American engineers were approaching fighter design from an entirely different direction. Rather than optimizing for the turning fight, they were asking a different question. What if we build a fighter so fast and powerful that it never has to accept the enemy's terms of engagement? What if speed and firepower could trump agility entirely? The answer to that question was currently sitting on Henderson Field, waiting for its first combat mission. The Corsair's development had begun in 1938 when the US Navy issued specifications that seemed almost fantastical. They wanted a carrier fighter exceeding 400 miles per hour, with range to escort strikes deep into enemy territory, armed heavily enough to destroy bombers with short bursts, yet still capable of operating from carrier decks. Rex Beisel and his team at Chance Vought faced contradictions that seemed impossible to resolve. High speed required a powerful engine. The most powerful available was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder monster producing 2,000 horsepower. But extracting maximum performance from this engine demanded a propeller over 13 feet in diameter. A 13-foot propeller created ground clearance problems that conventional landing gear couldn't solve without becoming prohibitively long and heavy. Beisel's solution was radical. Instead of a straight wing, he designed an inverted gull configuration. The wing roots mounted high on the fuselage, then angled sharply downward before leveling out toward the wingtips. This allowed shorter, stronger landing gear while maintaining propeller clearance. The bent wing looked unconventional, almost awkward in static photographs, but wind tunnel testing revealed unexpected benefits. The configuration actually reduced drag at the wing fuselage junction, improving overall aerodynamic efficiency. The massive R2800 engine dominated the aircraft's nose, its enormous cowling giving the Corsair a blunt, aggressive appearance. The three-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller, 13 feet 4 inches in diameter, would become one of the most distinctive features of the design. In full voice, that propeller and engine combination produced a sound that pilots would later describe as unforgettable, a deep, thunder-like roar that announced the Corsair's presence from miles away. Fuel capacity was generous, with tanks distributed through the fuselage and wings holding over 350 gallons internally. Drop tanks could extend this even further, giving the Corsair the range to escort bombers deep into Japanese-held territory. This was strategic capability that the Zero, despite its impressive range, couldn't match while maintaining combat effectiveness. Armament represented another radical departure from previous American fighters. 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing panel, each loaded with 400 rounds. When all 6 guns fired simultaneously, the Corsair delivered approximately 70 pounds of projectiles per second onto its target. This was double the Zero's firepower, and the .50 caliber rounds carried far more destructive energy than the Zero's mix of rifle caliber machine guns and light cannon. The positioning of these guns in the wings, outboard of the propeller arc, eliminated the convergence problems that plagued earlier fighters. While wing-mounted guns on other aircraft had to be aimed to converge at a specific distance, often 300 yards, the Corsair's gun arrangement created a wider field of fire. Pilots could engage effectively from 200 yards out to 400 yards, without worrying about convergence angles. The concentration of fire at 300 yards was devastating enough to shred any Japanese aircraft with a 2-second burst. Each .50 caliber round weighed approximately 1.5 ounces and travelled at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Upon impact, these rounds could penetrate armour plate, punch through engine blocks, sever control cables, and ignite fuel tanks. The ammunition mix typically included armour-piercing incendiary rounds, standard ball ammunition, and tracer rounds. The tracers, loaded every 5th round, allowed pilots to walk their fire onto target, adjusting aim based on the visible stream of glowing projectiles. The psychological effect of Corsair firepower on Japanese pilots cannot be overstated. Zeros that had been designed with minimal armor and unprotected fuel systems were catastrophically vulnerable to .50 caliber fire. A single armor-piercing incendiary round penetrating a fuel tank could turn a Zero into a fireball within seconds. Japanese pilots reported that surviving even a brief burst from a Corsair was nearly impossible. The combination of fire density and projectile energy meant that any solid hit would likely result in aircraft destruction. The prototype first flew in May 1940. Test pilot Lyman Bollard pushed it to 405 miles per hour in level flight, making it the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour. Navy officials were impressed but demanded changes. The cockpit moved back to accommodate more fuselage fuel tanks, compromising forward visibility. Armor was added behind the pilot. Self-sealing fuel tanks were installed, adding weight but dramatically improving survivability compared to the Zero's unprotected tanks. Production began in mid-1941, but carrier qualification trials exposed serious problems. The long nose blocked the pilot's view during landing approaches at critical moments. The aircraft stalled, unpredictably in tight carrier approach turns. The stiff landing gear caused alarming bounces on touchdown. Most concerning were unexpected wing stalls in certain flight regimes that could prove fatal. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics concluded that while the Corsair was a magnificent fighter, it was too dangerous for inexperienced pilots to operate from carriers. The decision was made to assign initial production to Marine Corps squadrons operating from land bases, where carrier landing characteristics were irrelevant and experienced pilots could master the aircraft's demanding nature. This proved fortunate. Marine squadrons in the South Pacific desperately needed capable fighters. They had been fighting with F-4F Wildcats and Army cast-offs, facing elite Japanese pilots with inadequate equipment. The promise of a fighter matching or exceeding enemy performance was transformative. Marine pilots accepted the Corsair's difficult handling in exchange for its overwhelming advantages. By late 1942, production Corsairs began reaching Marine squadrons. VMF 124, commanded by Major William Gies, received the first operational aircraft in October. Pilots spent months learning the Corsair's characteristics. It torqued violently during takeoff, requiring strong rudder input. Throttle movements needed to be smooth and deliberate. The stall characteristics demanded constant vigilance. But pilots also discovered extraordinary capabilities that made the demanding flight characteristics worthwhile. In level flight, the Corsair reached 420 miles per hour, 70 miles per hour faster than the Zero. In a dive properly managed, it could exceed 450 miles per hour, speeds where the Zero's lightweight construction began threatening structural failure. Climb rate was exceptional, over 3,000 feet per minute at sea level, allowing rapid altitude gain that Japanese fighters couldn't match. Most critically, the Corsair possessed tremendous energy retention. It could convert speed into altitude and back with minimal loss, enabling vertical maneuvers that bled energy from lighter fighters. A Corsair pilot could dive to attack, then pull up steeply and rocket back to altitude while pursuing Zeros struggled to follow. This energy management would become the key to Corsair dominance, the ability to fight in the vertical dimension where power and speed trumped agility. The concept of energy fighting was relatively new to American pilots in early 1943. Traditional fighter combat emphasized horizontal maneuvering, turning to get behind an opponent. But the Corsair's performance characteristics demanded a different mental model. Pilots had to think in terms of energy states rather than position. An aircraft at high altitude with moderate speed had more total energy than an aircraft at low altitude with high speed. Understanding how to manage this energy, when to trade altitude for speed, when to trade speed back to altitude, became the foundation of successful Corsair tactics. Marine instructors developed training programs emphasizing energy management. Pilots practiced zoom climbs, pulling up sharply from high-speed flight to convert velocity into altitude. They learned the chandelle, a climbing turn that maintained energy while changing direction. They mastered the high yo-yo, a vertical maneuver that used altitude to prevent overshooting a target. These techniques were foreign to pilots trained in traditional horizontal fighting, but they were essential to exploiting the Corsair's capabilities. The learning curve was steep, and not all pilots adapted quickly. Some, conditioned by years of believing that tight turns determined fighter combat outcomes, struggled to resist the temptation to dogfight with Zeros. Squadron commanders emphasized repeatedly that a Corsair pilot who allowed himself to be drawn into a slow-speed turning fight had surrendered every advantage the aircraft provided. Discipline was paramount. Maintain speed, maintain altitude, attack only when conditions favored you, disengage if they don't. Those who mastered these principles became devastatingly effective. They learned to read a combat situation in 3 dimensions, assessing relative energy states, predicting where opponents would be seconds in the future, positioning themselves for attacks that were over before the enemy could react. The best Corsair pilots operated with a cold, calculated efficiency that Japanese pilots found terrifying. There was no heroic dogfighting, no dramatic maneuvering, just sudden violent attacks from altitude, followed by climbs back to safety. By January 1943, VMF 124 was combat-ready. Orders came to deploy to Guadalcanal, where Marines were locked in brutal attrition against Japanese air power based at Rabaul. The squadron's Corsairs loaded aboard escort carriers and shipped to the South Pacific. On February 12, 1943, the first Corsairs landed at Henderson Field. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft immediately spotted them. Reports filtered back to Rabaul, describing a new fighter type, large and powerful-looking. Intelligence officers remained uncertain about capabilities. Within days, uncertainty would transform into shock, then fear. February 14, 1943. 8 Corsairs from VMF 124 formed the morning combat air patrol, led by Major G's. Intelligence reported a major Japanese raid forming at Rabaul, likely targeting Allied shipping near Guadalcanal. The Corsairs climbed steadily to 25,000 feet, exploiting their exceptional high-altitude performance. At that altitude, the massive Pratt & Whitney engines maintained full power while Japanese radial engines lost significant output. At 10:45 hours, the controller radioed vectors toward an incoming formation. 70 aircraft detected by coast watchers, mixture of Zero fighters and Betty bombers, approaching from the northwest. Corsair pilots checked weapons, adjusted oxygen masks, scanned the sky ahead. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh spotted them first, contrails scratching thin white lines across blue sky at 20,000 feet. The Japanese formation, layered with escorts high and low surrounding the bombers. Walsh radioed the sighting. Major G's confirmed and issued terse instructions. They would dive from altitude, strike the Zero top cover, then pull back up for another pass. The attack began with Corsairs nearly vertical, plunging from 25,000 feet in a dive that accelerated past 400 miles per hour within seconds. Zero pilots above the bomber formation never saw them coming. The first warning was when Walsh's 650 caliber guns shredded the lead Zero's fuselage in a 3-second burst. The Japanese aircraft disintegrated, pieces tumbling through the formation below. Major G's selected another Zero, attempting to turn into the attack. At 430 miles per hour, G's closed distance in heartbeats. His guns opened at 300 yards, 50 caliber rounds walking up the Zero's wing into the cockpit. The Japanese pilot died instantly. The Zero rolled inverted and fell away burning. Other Corsair pilots found targets in the stunned enemy formation. The shock among Japanese pilots was profound. One moment, maintaining standard escort positions, comfortable in their altitude advantage. The next, aircraft exploding around them from attacks materializing from nowhere. Zero's attempted response using standard doctrine. Turn into the threat, use superior maneuverability to reverse positions. But when they tried pursuing the diving Corsairs, they encountered horrifying reality. The Corsairs were simply too fast. Zero pilots pushing to maximum dive speed barely reached 350 miles per hour before airframe stress warnings forced them to level off. By that time, Corsairs were already climbing back to altitude, using retained energy to zoom above the Japanese formation. The vertical maneuver looked effortless, yet placed Americans back in dominant position within seconds. Lieutenant Walsh pulled out of his initial dive and immediately began climbing. His airspeed indicator showed 380 miles per hour, more than enough energy for what came next. He pulled the stick back firmly but smoothly, pointing the Corsair's nose skyward. The powerful engine responded instantly, hauling the heavy fighter back through 10,000 feet, 15,000, 20,000. As Walsh leveled at 23,000 feet, he spotted 3 Zeros below attempting to climb in pursuit. They were struggling, engines unable to maintain power at altitude. Walsh rolled inverted and dove again, this time approaching with deflection, cutting across the formation's path. His target was a Zero that had fallen behind, pilot perhaps less experienced or simply unable to match the climbing pace. Walsh's guns, they found range. The Zero's unprotected fuel tanks erupted instantly. The aircraft fell away trailing fire and black smoke. Walsh's combat report, filed later, contained a line that would echo through Marine squadrons throughout the campaign. Enemy attempted turning engagement at 15,000 feet. I maintained speed and executed climbing reversal to 22,000 feet. From this position, I attacked at will. Enemy could not follow. This pattern proved devastatingly effective. Dive, attack, zoom, climb back to altitude. Corsairs struck the Japanese formation 3 times in 15 minutes, destroying 8 Zeros and damaging several bombers. Not a single Corsair was lost. Japanese bomber pilots, deprived of effective fighter cover, jettisoned loads early and turned for home. The mission failed completely. After-action reports from surviving Japanese pilots revealed confusion and alarm. They described aircraft with impossible speed and climb capability. They noted American pilots refusing conventional dogfighting, using vertical tactics that Japanese training hadn't prepared them to counter. One Zero pilot reported attempting to pursue an American fighter in a dive and seeing airframe stress warnings illuminate. When he leveled to avoid structural damage, the American aircraft had already escaped and was climbing back to altitude beyond reach. At Rabaul, intelligence officers reviewed reports with growing concern. Descriptions were consistent across multiple pilots. This new American fighter possessed performance characteristics fundamentally challenging Japanese tactical assumptions. Orders went out for additional reconnaissance to photograph and identify these aircraft more precisely. At Henderson Field, Marine pilots of VMF 124 gathered for debrief. Mood was jubilant but analytical. Major G's emphasized maintaining altitude discipline. The Corsair's advantage lay in energy, in dictating engagement terms. Pilots drawn into low-altitude turning fights would surrender that advantage. The Zero was still more maneuverable. In horizontal dogfights at 10,000 feet, a Zero could still outturn a Corsair. But Corsair pilots were learning they never needed to accept that fight. If a Zero got on your tail, you didn't turn to fight. You dove away, accelerating beyond the Zero's ability to follow, then climbed back to safety. If Zeros appeared above you, you didn't try out climbing them through traditional tactics. You built speed first, converted that speed to altitude in a zoom climb Japanese fighters couldn't match. The sky was becoming three-dimensional battlefield where velocity and altitude, properly managed, trumped maneuverability. Over following weeks, more Corsair squadrons arrived. VMF 121 flew their first combat mission February 28th. VMF 122 and VMF 123 followed in early March. Each squadron went through a learning period, pilots adjusting to the Corsair's demanding characteristics and internalizing vertical tactics, maximizing the aircraft's strengths. Once that learning curve was completed, results were consistently one-sided. By March 1943, Japanese naval air groups at Rabaul reported Corsair sightings with increasing frequency. Pattern was always the same. American fighters diving from altitude at tremendous speed, attacking with devastating firepower, climbing back to safety before Japanese fighters could respond. Zero pilots were instructed to avoid engagement when Corsairs held altitude advantage. In practice, this meant avoiding engagement almost always, since Corsair pilots maintained altitude discipline as primary tactical principle. Psychological impact on Japanese pilots was severe. Many had entered war as confident veterans, secure in their aircraft's superiority and their own skill. Now they faced opponents who could attack at will and seemed untouchable. The comfortable world of horizontal maneuvering combat, where Japanese training excelled, had been replaced by vertical battlefield where the enemy held every advantage. Morale suffered. Pilots who once volunteered eagerly for missions now approached them with dread. Industrial implications were equally grim. United States was producing Corsairs at increasing rates. Chance Vaught's Connecticut factory was joined by Goodyear and Brewster plants, each adding to the flood of F-4Us reaching the Pacific. By spring 1943, production exceeded 400 aircraft monthly. Japanese fighter production struggled to replace combat losses. Zero was still manufactured in substantial numbers, but each Zero lost represented an experienced pilot, and replacement pilots received less training as war demands intensified. At Japanese Naval Aviation Headquarters, debates intensified about countering the Corsair threat. Some argued for new tactics, perhaps night operations or low-altitude attacks where Corsair advantages would be minimized. Others insisted new fighter designs were needed, aircraft matching American speed and climb rate. Both approaches required time and resources Japan increasingly lacked. The tactical debates revealed deep divisions within Japanese Naval Aviation Command. Conservative officers argued that the fundamental principles of fighter combat remained valid, that superior pilots with adequate training could still prevail through skill and determination. They pointed to individual instances where experienced Zero pilots had successfully engaged Corsairs, usually by catching them at low altitude or during takeoff and landing. These isolated successes, they argued, proved that the problem was not insurmountable. Progressive officers countered that these anecdotal successes masked a catastrophic trend. The overall kill ratios were devastating. Japanese fighter units were being decimated. Experienced pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. The Americans were achieving air superiority not through superior skill, but through superior equipment that allowed even average pilots to dominate. Continuing to rely on tactics designed for the Zero against the Corsair was, they argued, institutional suicide. Attempts to develop new tactics met limited success. Some units experimented with altitude fighting, trying to engage Corsairs at 30,000 feet or higher, where the thin air might equalize performance. But the Corsair's turbocharged engines maintained power at altitudes where Japanese engines gasped for oxygen. Zero pilots struggling to maintain control at extreme altitude found themselves even more vulnerable to diving attacks from Corsairs operating comfortably thousands of feet above them. Other units tried coordinated attacks, using multiple fighters to engage a single Corsair simultaneously from different angles. The theory was sound. If enough Zeros could force a Corsair into continuous evasive maneuvering, it would eventually lose energy and become vulnerable. In practice, Corsair formations maintained mutual support that prevented isolation of individual aircraft. When multiple Zeros converged on one Corsair, his wingmen would dive to assist, and the attacking Zeros would find themselves under fire from multiple directions. Night operations offered some respite, but only temporarily. Japanese bombers that shifted to nighttime raids initially enjoyed success, but the appearance of radar-equipped night fighter Corsairs, the F-4U-2 variant, ended that sanctuary. These aircraft, equipped with primitive but functional air intercept radar mounted in a pod on the right wing, could detect bombers in total darkness and position for attacks. Japanese air crews discovered that darkness no longer provided protection. The bent-wing fighters could find them even when human vision was useless. The dive became the maneuver Japanese pilots feared most. When Corsairs attacked from altitude, dive speed was so overwhelming that evasion became nearly impossible. Zero pilots reported seeing Corsairs at distant specks one moment, opening fire the next. Closing speed was too high for human reaction times to process effectively. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh refined his dive attack technique over dozens of combat missions. He learned to begin dives from at least 5,000 feet above targets. This gave space to build speed while maintaining sight of prey. He would roll inverted, point the nose at empty space ahead of where target would be in 5 seconds, then pull through to vertical. Corsair would accelerate rapidly, pushing through 400 miles per hour, 420, 440. Wind noise became a roar. Controls stiffened with increasing air pressure. Airframe shuddered slightly but remained solid, testament to robust construction that added weight but brought survivability. At 300 yards, Walsh would center target in gun sight and squeeze trigger. 650 caliber guns would thunder for 2 or 3 seconds. Combined firepower, 70 pounds of projectiles per second, was devastating. Zeros struck by this concentrated fire often simply came apart, pieces tumbling through air. Even glancing hits could prove fatal, as unarmored fuel tanks ignited and lightweight structure failed under high-speed fragmentation damage stress. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. After the firing pass, Walsh would continue diving for a few seconds, building even more speed, then pull back on the stick. G-forces pressed him into his seat as the Corsair's nose rose toward sky. Aircraft would rocket upward, converting speed to altitude in nearly vertical climb. Within 30 seconds, Walsh would be back at starting altitude or higher, ready to repeat the process. Japanese fighters attempting to follow would stall and fall away, engines unable to maintain power at high altitude with reduced airspeed of a climb. By June 1943, Walsh had perfected these techniques. He became one of the Pacific's leading aces. His final tally would reach 21 confirmed victories, every single one scored in a Corsair. His combat reports became required reading for new Corsair pilots arriving in theatre. They emphasized patience, discipline, and absolute imperative of maintaining energy. Never slow down to fight on enemy terms. Always maintain speed and altitude advantage. Use Corsair strengths, refuse engagement where enemy might have any chance of equalizing the contest. Gregory Boyington, former Flying Tiger who took command of VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron, exemplified Corsair tactics differently. Boyington had flown against Japanese aircraft in China and understood their capabilities intimately. He recognized immediately that Corsair performance allowed tactics that would have been suicidal in earlier American fighters. Boyington's approach was aggressive to the point of recklessness. Corsairs directly toward Japanese formations, accepting apparent disadvantage of head-on approaches. But as ranges closed, Boyington used Corsair superior speed to control engagement geometry. If Japanese fighters turned to meet him, he would simply extend combat, maintaining speed advantage and refusing turning fight. If they tried diving away, his Corsair could follow and overtake. If they climbed, he could climb faster or use speed to zoom above them. In one engagement over Rabaul in September 1943, Boyington led 12 Corsairs against an estimated 50 Japanese aircraft. Americans dove into formation, scattering escort fighters and destroying several bombers in initial pass. As Japanese fighters tried organizing response, Boyington directed pilots to maintain speed and altitude discipline. Corsairs climbed back to altitude, reformed, struck again. Then a third time. Japanese formation was shredded, losing over 20 aircraft. Boyington scored 5 kills in that single engagement. Not a single Corsair was lost. Japanese pilots surviving encounters with Boyington's squadron reported being hunted. Americans seemed to know exactly when and where to attack, appearing from altitude with devastating speed, then vanishing before effective response was possible. Feeling of helplessness was profound. Japanese pilots were accustomed to thinking of air combat as contest of skill and courage. Now it felt like systematic execution, with Americans holding all advantages. Vertical reversals, Corsair pilots executed with routine ease, were particularly demoralizing. In traditional dogfighting doctrine, if you dove on an enemy and he dove away, you had failed to press home attack, but you had still forced defensive action, made him give up altitude advantage and retreat to lower energy states. Against Corsairs, that calculus was inverted. A Corsair diving away wasn't retreating, it was temporarily disengaging to rebuild energy, and it would return to attack within seconds, climbing back to altitude faster than Japanese fighters could follow. Japanese pilots began reporting almost supernatural quality to Corsair energy management. One veteran Zero pilot described it in his after-action report, translated from original Japanese. The American fighter dove past us at incredible speed. We attempted following but could not match his velocity without risk to our airframes. When we leveled off, he had already climbed back above us. It was as if he could ignore gravity, ascending and descending at will while we remained bound to normal flight physics. This perception, while not literally accurate, captured tactical reality. Corsair's combination of engine power, propeller efficiency, and robust airframe construction allowed it to operate in flight regimes Japanese fighters couldn't safely enter. In steep dives, Zeros would begin experiencing control, flutter, and structural stress at speeds Corsair handled comfortably. In sustained climbs at high altitude, Zero's engine would lose power, while Corsair's turbocharged R2800 maintained full output. Performance envelope was simply not comparable. By late 1943, Japanese tactical directives regarding Corsairs had become explicit and stark. A captured document from the 251st Air Group, translated by American intelligence, included these instructions. When encountering American bent-wing fighter, do not attempt engagement if enemy holds altitude advantage. Do not attempt pursuing in diving attacks. Do not attempt outclimbing enemy. If engaged, attempt luring American pilot into low-altitude horizontal maneuvering combat. If this fails, disengage immediately and seek cloud cover or terrain masking. These defensive instructions represented complete reversal of aggressive spirit characterizing Japanese fighter doctrine at war's outset. Pilots were being told, essentially, to avoid combat unless conditions were overwhelmingly favorable. Given Corsair performance, the characteristics and tactical discipline of marine pilots, those favorable conditions rarely arose. Impact on Japanese operations extended beyond simple loss rates. Bomber formations could no longer be effectively protected by Zero escorts when Corsairs were present. Reconnaissance missions became increasingly hazardous, with American fighters able to chase down even fastest Japanese scout planes. Close air support missions near American positions were virtual suicide, with Corsairs able to intercept attackers before they reached targets. Strategic initiative in air war had shifted decisively. Individual pilot experiences reflected this broader shift. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, the experienced pilot who first spotted Corsairs at Henderson Field, encountered them in combat in May 1943. Leading a formation of Zeros escorting bombers bound for Guadalcanal, Sakai spotted contrails high above. He recognized distinctive appearance immediately. Corsairs, at least 8, holding altitude advantage. Sakai ordered his formation to climb, hoping to reach Americans' altitude before they struck. But Corsairs simply climbed higher, maintaining advantage effortlessly. Then they dove. Sakai's formation scattered as American fighters plunged through them at terrifying speed. Sakai attempted turning into one attacker, but Corsair was past him and climbing back to altitude before he completed his turn. A second Corsair attacked from different angle, forcing Sakai into defensive dive. When he pulled out at low altitude, he was alone. His wingman was gone, last seen with Corsair on his tail. Sakai managed returning to base, but the experience shook him profoundly. He had been one of Imperial Navy's top fighter pilots, with proven skill and extensive combat experience. Against Corsairs, his skills had been irrelevant. Americans dictated every phase of engagement. They chose when and how to attack. They chose when to disengage. Sakai had been reduced to reactive defense, and even that barely sufficed for survival. In mission debrief, he recommended operations in areas with Corsair presence should be carefully reconsidered. Such recommendations became more common throughout Japanese naval aviation units. Squadron commanders noted declining morale and increasing reluctance among pilots to fly missions where Corsairs might be encountered. This wasn't cowardice. These were experienced military aviators who had faced death repeatedly with courage and discipline. But psychological burden of flying into combat, where enemy holds overwhelming advantage, where training and equipment are inadequate, where survival seems depending more on enemy mercy than own skill, that burden was eroding fighting spirit Japanese doctrine relied upon. Industrial numbers told their own grim story. By September 1943, United States was producing over 500 Corsairs monthly across 3 manufacturing facilities. Japanese Zero production, despite given priority, barely exceeded 350 aircraft monthly. But raw production numbers understated growing disparity. American factories also produced P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs. Total American fighter production exceeded 2,000 aircraft monthly. Japan's total fighter production across all types struggled, reaching 600 monthly. Training differences compounded production gap. American pilots assigned to Corsair squadrons received extensive training before deployment. They arrived in theater with 300 or more flight hours, including 50 hours in type. They had practiced vertical tactics, high-altitude operations, and energy management extensively. Many trained against captured Japanese aircraft, giving them direct experience with enemy capabilities and limitations. Japanese replacement pilots, by contrast, were rushed through abbreviated training programs. Need to replace combat losses meant training time was cut from 18 months to 6 months, then to 4 months. Pilots arriving at frontline units in late 1943 averaged less than 100 total flight hours. Many had never flown above 20,000 feet. Few had experience with vertical tactics American pilots employed routinely. They were sent into combat against better-equipped, better-trained opponents flying superior aircraft. Mathematical inevitability of this situation was becoming apparent to some Japanese officers. Each engagement cost them experienced pilots who couldn't be adequately replaced. Each loss reduced overall competence of fighter units. Meanwhile, American units gained experience, refined tactics, and built institutional knowledge base, making them progressively more effective. Trajectory was unsustainable, pointing toward future where Japanese air power would simply cease existing as effective force. Yet war continued, missions were flown, pilots climbed into zeros and took off toward encounters they increasingly understood to be hopeless. Warrior ethos, Japanese military culture cultivated, provided some psychological sustenance, framing death in combat as honorable and meaningful. But even that framework strained under accumulated weight of unwinnable battles against enemy whose material superiority grew more overwhelming with each passing month. By end of 1943, Corsair had established absolute dominance in Solomons. Japanese daylight air operations in region had virtually ceased. Supply missions were conducted at night or not at all. Great naval air campaign begun with confidence in 1941 had been reduced to desperate defensive operations by late 1943, and Corsair, bent-wing fighter Japanese pilots learned to fear, stood as primary symbol of that transformation. Technical evolution of Corsair continued throughout war, each variant bringing improvements, widening performance gap further. F4U-1A model, introduced mid-1943, featured raised cockpit canopy, improving visibility during carrier approaches. This modification, while primarily intended to eventually allow Navy carrier operations, also gave pilots better situational awareness in combat. Improved visibility meant Corsair pilots could spot enemy aircraft sooner and track multiple threats more effectively. F4U-1C variant replaced 6 50 caliber machine guns with 4 20mm cannons. Each cannon fired explosive shells, causing catastrophic damage with even brief contact. 0 struck by 20mm shells, often simply disintegrated completely. Lightweight airframe unable to withstand explosive fragmentation. Marine pilots flying cannon-armed Corsairs reported needing only 1 to 2 second bursts to destroy enemy aircraft, compared to 3 to 5 seconds often required with 50 caliber guns. F4U-1D model, appearing early 1944, added provisions for carrying bombs and rockets under wings. This transformed Corsair from purely air superiority fighter into multi-role aircraft capable of devastating ground attack. 8 5-inch rockets or 2,000-pound bombs could be carried without significantly degrading flight performance. Corsairs began appearing over Japanese installations in ground attack roles, using speed and robust construction to survive anti-aircraft fire that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. But it was in air-to-air combat that Corsair's legend truly solidified. Kill ratios achieved by Marine Corsair squadrons were unprecedented. VMF-2-14, Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron, claimed 97 aerial victories against 9 Corsairs lost to enemy action during initial combat tour. VMF-2-15 achieved ratio of 73-4. VMF-121 recorded 68 victories with only 3 combat losses. These statistics represented more than tactical success. They demonstrated systematic superiority across every dimension of aerial combat. Human dimension of this dominance was captured in letters and diaries of pilots on both sides. American Corsair pilots wrote home with growing confidence, describing missions where they felt almost invulnerable. One Marine lieutenant wrote to family in December 1943, "Flying Corsair is like driving racing car against bicycles. Japanese pilots are brave, but they have no chance. We can choose when to fight and when to leave. They cannot catch us, cannot climb with us, and their guns barely scratch our armor when they manage to shoot." Japanese pilots' writings revealed mirror image of despair. Captured diary from Zero pilot killed over Rabaul in January 1944 contained this entry. "We are ordered to escort bombers again tomorrow. Americans will be waiting with their new fighters. I do not expect to return. Our aircraft cannot match theirs. Our tactics cannot defeat theirs. We fly to our deaths with honor, but without hope of victory. Empire asks us to sacrifice ourselves, and we will obey. But I wonder if our deaths serve any purpose beyond delaying inevitable." Strategic implications rippled across Pacific theater. As Corsair squadrons multiplied and pushed northward with American advance, Japanese air power was systematically eliminated from contested regions. Philippines campaign in late 1944 saw Corsairs achieve air superiority within days of invasion. Battle of Leyte Gulf, largest naval engagement in history, it was fought under skies controlled by American carrier aircraft, including Corsairs finally cleared for carrier operations after modifications improving landing characteristics. Human cost to Japanese pilots was staggering. Training units struggled producing replacement pilots even as quality of those pilots declined. By 1944, Japanese fighter pilots arriving at frontline units averaged 60 flight hours total, less than 1/5 training time of American counterparts. These poorly trained pilots flying obsolescent aircraft against seasoned Marines in Corsairs faced slaughter. Life expectancy for Japanese fighter pilots in contested areas dropped to weeks or even days. Individual stories illustrated broader tragedy. Young men who trained to become fighter pilots with dreams of honor and glory found themselves in nightmare where courage and dedication brought nothing but death. They flew missions knowing they were outmatched, holding formation until American fighters dove from altitude with terrible speed. Some died in first combat mission. Others survived a few encounters through luck before inevitable end. Corsair pilots who fought them rarely took satisfaction in this one-sided dominance. Professional military aviators respected courage, and Japanese pilots continued showing tremendous bravery even in hopeless circumstances. But war demanded efficiency, and Corsair provided capability to destroy enemy air power decisively. Marine pilots executed missions with grim professionalism, recognizing every Japanese aircraft destroyed and every enemy pilot killed shortened war and saved American lives elsewhere. By mid-1944, Japanese aircraft industry was attempting desperately to produce fighters capable of matching Corsair. Nakajima Ki-84 Frank was fast and well-armed, capable of matching Corsair in speed at medium altitudes. Kawasaki Ki-100 combined good performance with excellent handling. Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden emphasized high-altitude interception, but none appeared in sufficient numbers to change strategic balance. Production facilities were being systematically destroyed by American bombing. Materials were scarce. Skilled workers were drafted into military service. Industrial base was collapsing. Even when these newer Japanese fighters reached operational units, they faced same fundamental problem. American pilots were better trained, flying in well-coordinated formations, supported by superior logistics and intelligence. Corsair's performance advantages, while perhaps less overwhelming against newer Japanese fighters, still existed, and accumulated experience of Marine squadrons who had been fighting for months or years gave them tactical sophistication Japanese units couldn't match. Final year of war saw Corsairs operating across entire Pacific, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, from Philippines to Japanese home islands. Distinctive bent-wing silhouette became synonymous with American air superiority. Transition to carrier operations, completed early 1945, allowed Corsairs to strike deep into Japanese territory as part of carrier task force raids. Japanese pilots defending homeland faced waves of American aircraft, including Corsairs as fast and deadly as they had been in Solomons 2 years earlier. Kamikaze campaigns, Japan's desperate response to overwhelming material disadvantage, met fierce resistance from Corsair-equipped combat air patrols. F-4U's speed allowed intercepting suicide attackers before they reached fleet. Its heavy armament could destroy attacking aircraft with single bursts. Its robust construction meant even damaged Corsairs often returned to carriers for repair. Statistics from Okinawa showed Corsairs accounting for nearly half of all kamikaze aircraft destroyed by fighters, despite representing less than 30% of American carrier fighter strength. Technological comparison between Corsair and Zero, aircraft symbolizing American and Japanese fighter design philosophies, revealed fundamental differences in approach. Zero, at combat weight of 9,500 pounds, could turn tightly and climb adequately, but was fragile and vulnerable. Corsair, at combat weight of 12,000 pounds, was faster, more heavily armed, better protected, and more versatile. Zero represented perfection of pre-war doctrine emphasizing agility. Corsair represented newer understanding that speed, firepower, and survivability should be prioritized. In practical terms, this meant that in any engagement between competent pilots, Corsair could dictate terms. If Zero tried to turn fight, Corsair simply refused engagement, using speed to extend and reset. If Zero tried to run, Corsair overtook it. If Zero tried to climb, Corsair climbed faster. There was no scenario where Zero held advantage except tightest horizontal turns at low speed, and Corsair pilots learned never to allow combat to devolve into that regime. Japanese attempts to develop counter-tactics proved futile. Some units tried massed attacks, hoping numerical superiority would overwhelm even superior aircraft, but Corsair formations maintained discipline, covering each other and preventing Japanese fighters from isolating individual Americans. Other units attempted ambushing Corsairs at low altitude where performance gap was narrower. But American intelligence and coastwatcher networks meant surprise was difficult to achieve, and Corsairs rarely flew at altitudes where ambush was viable. Night fighter variant, F-4U-2, equipped with primitive radar, extended American air superiority into hours of darkness. Japanese bombers that had survived by operating at night suddenly found themselves intercepted in total darkness by radar-equipped Corsairs. Psychological impact was profound. No time, no place, no condition provided safety from bent-wing fighters that seemed to hunt with supernatural awareness. By March 1945, Japanese fighter strength had been reduced to desperate defensive operations around home islands. Pilots with minimal training flew outdated aircraft against greatest concentration of American air power ever assembled. Outcome was predetermined. Corsairs roamed Japanese skies, destroying enemy aircraft in air and on ground, supporting relentless advance of American forces toward Japanese homeland. Human toll cannot be captured in statistics alone, though numbers are sobering. Japanese naval aviation, which began war with approximately 3,000 skilled fighter pilots, had effectively ceased to exist by mid-1945. Most of those original pilots were dead, victims of combat attrition against increasingly superior American equipment and tactics. Their replacements, undertrained and poorly equipped, followed them to death with grim regularity. Individual American aces accumulated remarkable victory totals. Gregory Boyington finished war with 28 confirmed victories, all in Corsairs. Kenneth Walsh's final tally reached 21. Robert Hansen scored 25 victories in brief 6 months of combat before being killed in ground attack mission. These pilots demonstrated that with proper equipment and training, American aviators could dominate any aerial battlefield. Corsair's legacy extended beyond World War II. Aircraft would serve in Korea, proving design sound enough to remain effective a decade after introduction. It would fly with numerous foreign air forces through 1960s, but most significant impact was psychological and doctrinal. Corsair proved air superiority could be achieved through technological superiority matched with proper tactics and training. It demonstrated fighter design should prioritize speed, firepower, and survivability over maneuverability alone. For Japanese pilots who survived war, memories of Corsair remained vivid decades later. Veterans interviewed in 1980s and 90s described shock of that first encounter, realization that training and aircraft were inadequate, a helpless feeling of being hunted by opponent they couldn't catch or escape. Some spoke with grudging respect for machine that destroyed their air force. Others couldn't discuss it without visible emotion, memories too painful even after 40 years. Bent-wing fighter that appeared over Guadalcanal in February 1943 had indeed shocked Japanese pilots. But it had done far more than shock them. It systematically destroyed their capability to contest control of air. It exposed fatal flaws in their fighter doctrine. It proved tactical assumptions serving them well in 1941 were obsolete by 1943. Zero's dominance had lasted barely a year before American industry and engineering produced aircraft rendering it obsolete. 450-mile-per-hour dive that horrified Japanese pilots became symbol of this transformation. When Japanese radio intercepts captured the message, "Avoid all vertical engagements with bent-wing fighter," American intelligence officers recognized it as confirmation of complete tactical dominance. Japanese pilots were being ordered not to fight. Their doctrine, training, entire approach to air combat had been invalidated. Sky belonged to Corsair. In final months of war, as Japan faced invasion and ultimate defeat, role of Corsair shifted, but dominance never wavered. Aircraft that established air superiority in Solomons now supported conquest of Japanese home islands themselves. Corsairs provided close air support for Marines fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, bombs and rockets destroying defensive positions with surgical precision. They flew combat air patrol over massive invasion fleets, protecting ships that would carry American forces to Japan itself. They struck airfields across Kyushu and Honshu, destroying Japanese aircraft on ground before they could mount kamikaze attacks. Technical specifications that once seemed fantastical in 1938 had become routine operational reality by 1945. Maximum speed of 425 miles per hour, service ceiling of 41,000 feet, range exceeding 1,000 miles with drop tanks, 6 50 caliber machine guns, or 4 20mm cannons, provisions for 2,000 pounds of bombs or 8 rockets, all packaged in airframe robust enough to absorb battle damage and return home, flown by pilots trained to exploit every advantage aircraft offered. Japanese fighter development, hampered by material shortages and systematic destruction of industrial facilities, never caught up. J-2M Raiden Jack could match Corsair at high altitude but appeared in tiny numbers. N-1KJ Shiden George was maneuverable and well-armed but suffered reliability problems and scarce production. Ki-84 Frank was perhaps closest. Japan came to matching American fighter performance, but by time it reached operational units in numbers, tactical situation was hopeless. American numerical superiority, combined with better training and logistics, meant even equivalent aircraft wouldn't change outcome. Human stories from war's final months reflected completeness of American dominance. Japanese pilots, some with only 50 or 60 hours total flight time, were sent against American formations, including veterans with hundreds of combat missions. Results were predictable and tragic. Young men who should have been students or apprentices were instead dying in obsolete aircraft against opponents they had no realistic chance of defeating. One captured diary from Japanese pilot shot down near Okinawa in April 1945 contained this entry, written night before final mission. "Tomorrow I fly against Americans again. My aircraft is old and damaged. Engine runs roughly and controls are stiff. But these are only aircraft we have left. I have 12 hours in this type. My instructor told me I was not ready for combat. But there is no choice. Americans have bent-wing fighters. I have seen them. They are faster than anything we can field. I do not expect to survive. I write this so my family will know I died doing my duty, even though I knew it was hopeless." American pilots, reading such captured documents after war, often expressed regret at waste of young lives. But in moment, professional necessity demanded they destroy enemy aircraft and pilots as efficiently as possible. Corsair provided means to do exactly that. It was a weapon of overwhelming effectiveness, and its pilots used it without hesitation because stakes, American lives saved, Japanese aggression defeated, justified terrible mathematics of aerial combat. War ended August 1945 with Japan's surrender. Corsair had been in combat for 30 months, from February 1943 to August 1945. In that time, Marine Corsair squadrons alone destroyed over 2,000 Japanese aircraft in confirmed aerial combat. Navy and other services added hundreds more to that total. Corsair losses to enemy action totaled fewer than 200 aircraft. Kill ratio exceeded 10-1, and in many individual squadron records reached 15 or even 20-1. These numbers represented more than aerial victories. They represented systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation as effective force. They represented achievement of air superiority, enabling every subsequent American operation in Pacific. They represented validation of design philosophy, prioritizing speed, power, and survivability over maneuverability. And they represented courage and skill of pilots who flew Corsair into combat, month after month, against enemy who never stopped fighting even when hope of victory had long since vanished. Post-war analysis of Pacific Air War gave Corsair prominent place in understanding American victory. Aviation historians recognized that while many factors contributed to Japan's defeat, loss of air superiority was decisive, and Corsair, more than any other single aircraft type, had delivered that loss of air superiority. Japanese documents captured after war confirmed what American pilots observed. Japanese naval aviation had been shattered by encounters with aircraft they simply couldn't match. Interviews with surviving Japanese pilots provided painful testimony to Corsair's dominance. Saburo Sakai, who survived war despite severe injuries, described Corsair in memoir as most formidable opponent I ever faced. Zero could outturn it, but that advantage was meaningless when American pilot could simply refuse turning fight. Their speed and climb rate made them almost invulnerable if flown properly, and American pilots learned very quickly to fly properly. Other Japanese veterans spoke of psychological burden of knowing. Before every mission, they would likely face aircraft superior to their own. They described stress of maintaining formation discipline while watching for attacks that could come from any angle at terrifying speed. They recalled helpless frustration of attempting to intercept bombers while Corsairs dove through formations, scattering escorts and destroying aircraft before anyone could effectively respond. American Corsair pilots, in their own post-war reflections, often emphasized aircraft's forgiving nature despite demanding characteristics. Yes, it was difficult to land. Yes, it required strong arms and smooth inputs. Yes, it had quirks and habits that could kill careless pilots. But in combat, properly flown, it was simply best fighter in Pacific theater. Pilots trusted it, relied on it, and credited it with bringing them home mission after mission. Corsair's distinctive appearance became iconic. Inverted gull wing that had been purely engineering solution to propeller clearance problem became one of most recognizable silhouettes in aviation history. That appearance, combined with aircraft's combat record, ensured its place in public memory. It appeared in films and books, in museums and air shows, symbol of American industrial and military capability during Second World War. Technical innovations pioneered in Corsair influenced subsequent fighter design. Emphasis on powerful engines, integration of heavy firepower, robust construction prioritizing pilot survivability, these became standard features of American fighter aircraft through jet age. F-86 Sabre, that would dominate Korean War skies, incorporated lessons learned from Corsair combat operations. Later fighters continued evolution, but fundamental principles, speed over maneuverability, firepower over elegance, survivability over weight savings, traced directly to Corsair's success. For Marines who flew it, Corsair held special significance. It had been their aircraft when Navy considered it too difficult for carrier operations. Marine squadrons refined tactics, making it devastating. Marine aces scored majority of Corsair victories. Bond between Marine Corps and F4U remained strong decades after war, celebrated in reunions and commemorations, kept alive in memories of men who flew bent-wing bird into combat and returned to tell story. Ultimate verdict on Corsair came not from historians or aviation experts, but from men who faced it in battle. Japanese pilots who fought against Corsairs universally acknowledged its superiority. They recognized that when American industry produced that aircraft and American training produced pilots who could exploit its capabilities, outcome of Pacific Air War became inevitable. Shock they felt in those first encounters, when Corsairs dove past them at impossible speeds, never entirely faded. It remained vivid memory of moment when they realized their aircraft, tactics and doctrine had been overtaken by enemy who learned to build better machines and use them more effectively. Corsair delivered that shock. It transformed Pacific Air War. It gave American pilots aircraft capable of dominating any opponent, and in doing so, it helped secure victory that ended most destructive war in human history. Bent-wing fighter Japanese pilots learned to fear, had earned that fear through overwhelming performance, and its legacy endured long after guns fell silent. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.